This is episode 25 of Old Man Yells, and I'm Bob Burnett. Today's topic is Mars. Probably sounds like an unusual topic for this podcast, but you'll see shortly why I chose it and its relevance to the topics we normally cover here. It's January of 2025, and right now, and just a few days ago, President Trump was inaugurated for his second term. And as part of his inauguration speech, one of the things that he said was, I quote, "It's America's manifest destiny to plant the stars and stripes on Mars." Now, as most probably know, Elon Musk has played a key role over the last several months in Trump's election and appears to be playing a role in the new administration. And so it's not surprising that this sort of message would come out in the inauguration, because obviously Elon has been a very vocal proponent of getting missions to Mars and getting a colony started there. Now, from a technological perspective, I love what President Trump did. As a young boy, I was so influenced by the Apollo missions, the sending of the men to Mars. It had a big part in me becoming an engineer. I distinctly remember as a small boy, my teachers rolling in TVs on a big cart and putting on the live feeds of rockets taking off or of men walking, doing spacewalks and things like that. That was all a big part of my childhood. It had a massive influence on me. And so I'm excited about this because I think this can spawn a whole new generation of engineers and scientists, people that, dream of the stars and all the marvelous innovations that will come as a result of doing that. That said, we have to be very careful when we hear words like manifest destiny as part of the Mars missions, because manifest destiny can be a Pandora's box. There's a massive difference between exploration and colonization. Exploration is about the advancement of the human race, the footprint of humanity, again, pushing technology forward. And we'll all be better off for those efforts should that happen. But when we start talking about colonization, that can be positive or it can be very negative. The positive is what I think Elon has been driven by, which is the human race is susceptible. There are a wide variety of things that can happen on Earth, self-inflicted and otherwise, that could spell the end of the human race. And by having a presence on another planet, humanity can move forward, even when those things happen. So I think that's very noble. But when you hear the word manifest destiny, it implies a divine ordination for dominion over something. We use that in the U.S. starting in the mid 1800s to talk about the expansion of the country, to the western shores, something that did ultimately come true. But extending that to Mars is a very dangerous thing. If we were to plant a flag there, we have to ask ourselves, what does that imply? Does it imply that the U.S. now owns Mars? Does that mean its laws apply there? What about the property rights? What about the mineral rights? If China or Russia send missions to Mars afterward and plant their flag, do they own anything? Would the U.S. consider that an act of war? Or vice versa. Maybe they get there first and view it this same way, and then we're looked on by them as having infringed. So this is just a small sample of the deep questions that we as a human race and as a world face when we venture to the planets and the stars. Now, there have been several attempts to legislate on some of these kind of issues in the past, the biggest one being the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. You think about the world at that time, the threat of all out nuclear war was very prevalent, and that's what really drove this space treaty, which has been ratified by most of the major countries in the world. And it says, among other things, that no country can claim sovereignty over a celestial body, and that all pursuits outside the Earth must be peaceful, and that astronauts are envoys of mankind, not of any nation state. These are some of the key principles in this treaty. And I like the treaty, but frankly, it's very limited. And as I mentioned, its impetus had a lot more to do with trying to prevent wars and countries from placing nuclear weapons up into orbit and then being able to deliver them from space, and cause mass destruction. Had a lot more to do with that than with governments. That's my opinion, that ultimately any colonization of a celestial body will lead to that colony ultimately declaring its independence. This is, as soon as it's self-sufficient, that's, I think, the natural course of things. Just like the same thing has happened here, the U.S. declaring independence from Britain, actually all of the British expansion and the Spanish expansion and the Dutch and all the French, all of them have found ultimately that their colonization attempts, as they stretch from their base, ultimately fail, and that the people in these remote colonies eventually rebel against it, and seek independence. And I see no reason to believe that a Mars colony would be any different, especially given that it's millions of kilometers away in space. So they do not want to be beholden to the U.S., to the Earth, by any means. Now, it may take a little while for them to get self-sufficient, because I think that's the key part of my premise, is that as long as their livelihood and life depends on supplies and resources coming from Earth, they will acquiesce and probably be okay with some form of rule enforced remotely. But I don't believe that will last very long, frankly. So that leads us to a topic, though. And the topic is, once a remote colony exists, and especially as it's seeking independence, what would money look like on that planet? I've seen a few times in the past where some Bitcoiners have stated that they believe Bitcoin can be money for a place like Mars or the moon. Now, honestly, it might actually work fine on the moon, but it's not going to work for Mars. There are several reasons why, as great as Bitcoin is, it can't work in such a remote place. The first is that, depending on the planetary alignment, a round trip message, the best case is about 6 minutes, and the worst case is about 20 minutes. So this massive time delay creates a situation where reconciling with the Bitcoin blockchain really can't work. As I think everybody knows, the mean block time is about 10 minutes, but the median block time is actually 6 minutes and 40 seconds, meaning that in Bitcoin, half of all blocks come in less than 6 minutes and 40 seconds, and half come in more. Well, if half come in 6 minutes and 40 seconds, and the best case propagation delay between Earth and the Mars is 6 minutes, it means that 50% of the time or more, or well over 50% of the time, frankly, Mars would always be a block behind. And when the orbits are at their greatest disadvantage, it's easy to imagine situations where they're 10 blocks or more behind. Now, additionally, and more importantly, the cost of money on Mars should reflect the cost of production on Mars. So, stated another way, proof of work on Mars does not equal proof of work on Earth. No, in fact, there will be a massive disparity between the two, as the cost of energy and the cost of compute on Mars will likely exceed that on Earth by orders of magnitude for centuries. So Bitcoin cannot be the money on Mars. So while Bitcoin cannot be the money on Mars, it doesn't mean that Bitcoin's architecture could not be used as a base for a Mars monetary system. For simplicity, I've kind of created my own little version of what the framework of a Mars monetary system might look like. And I've called that monetary system Orson, and the currency, the token, the coin, I've called it Welles, obviously in honor of Orson Welles, who was the creator of the movie and actually radio episode called War of the Worlds, which is from the 40s, where the Martians invaded the U.S. and several people in the U.S. did not know it was fake, that it was theater, and some people got really freaked out by this. I also pay homage to Orson Welles because it turns out that he and I come from the same hometown, Kenosha, Wisconsin. So anyway, so we have this new monetary system called Orson, and so let's consider some of the key factors here as we're designing this system. So the first is that compared to Bitcoin, this is a ground up monetary system. It is not replacing an old one. Therefore, the issuance must be much slower. I think, as most Bitcoiners would know, 50% of all the Bitcoin came out in the first 4 years, and it will only take about 150 years for 100% of the supply to be realized. Now, that makes sense when the monetary system that's being created is one trying to replace the existing one. And Satoshi, I think, was brilliant in the way that he constructed the monetary supply and the release schedule. I think in the case of Mars, though, where we're talking about an entire planet developing, we have to think about full distribution being reached in maybe something like 2,000 years. Now, the premise of Bitcoin of absolute scarcity still makes sense to me, and I think it should be maintained. But instead of a halving every 4 years, I think the appropriate thing would be to have an issuance period that varies maybe once a decade, with about a 10% decline in each period's issuance. So my proposal would be that in the first issuance period, we would release about 1 million wells. If you remember, wells is the term that I used to describe the unit of account, or the measurement. So if we had 1 million wells come out in the first period, and we had a 10-year periods for 2,000 years, if you run that math out, what you find out is that it would ultimately have a terminal point of 10 million wells released over 2,000 years. So as the population of Mars grows, as the economy gets more robust, still have these same characteristics of a finite money supply, of inflation, of the monetary supply, not ever getting overbearing and a strain on the economy, and ultimately hitting this terminal point, in this case, of 10 million. Now, proof of work should absolutely be the confirmation mechanism of the Orson monetary network, but obviously it would need to be based on something well beyond SHA-256. So I won't get into how wallet addresses and things like that work, but I'm talking about the confirmation mechanism. And it would need to obviously be quantum proof, but I also think it would be wonderful if it was hyper resistant to ASIC type developments as well. I think that we'll talk about this in a little bit, but I think promoting a system that is more democratic, that's less prone to centralization and more likely to be led by the plebs of Mars than the corporations of Mars is very important. Now, Bitcoin has a 10-minute block time. That block time, there are several reasons why we believe that that block time was chosen, but I think part of it has to do with the propagation delay around Earth. And Mars, by the way, is physically about one half the size of Earth. So, in my case, for the design of this, my initial proposal would be that there be 5-minute blocks instead of 10-minute blocks. It should allow the network around Mars to stay in sync without too much risk of anybody getting out of whack or in a situation where they're trailing the main chain by a great deal. We may find as well as we start looking at this that even like a 3-minute block time would be okay because there won't be really legacy communication networks there. I would say on Mars, you can expect that everything is going to be very advanced and very quick. Now, the hardest part of creating Orson in the image of Bitcoin is how to decentralize it. As we all know, Bitcoin's decentralized nature is the result of a really unique set of circumstances and a really unique individual. And on Earth, in human society, it's my belief, and I know the belief of many other people, that it is not something that will ever be replicated. But Mars is a completely different situation. And I believe designing for decentralization there could be easier because we're starting from a clean slate. And here's how I see that happening. First is I think the architecture and code of the Orson monetary system would be designed on Earth by people who are not going to Mars. This eliminates their motivation to influence the design in a way that gives them any hope of gaining power or wealth from being the creator. So it should be very altruistic. Now, as colonists depart from Earth, I would propose that each is issued a node. And this node would be, for the Orson network, would be in the vision of the original node mentality employed by Bitcoin, meaning that the node also had mining capability. Now, operating the mining capability, just like in Bitcoin, will be optional. Because for the first several decades, at least, it's likely that energy on Mars will be very scarce, very precious. It will probably be rationed. So that means that each colonist will have to make important decisions about how frequently they operate the mining portion of the node. And they'll make decisions like, should I take a hot shower or mine? This provides a very interesting trade-off. And I believe it will force and encourage a lot of very low time preference behavior on Mars. People from the very beginning will know that their ability to earn some currency in the local economy gets instantly traded off with what they do. Do they watch a movie again? Do they take a shower? Do they go for a ride in a rover? Like all of these sort of things are energy expenses. And I could definitely see that each person has discretion over a certain amount of energy on a daily, monthly, annual basis. So, of course, the difficulty adjustment would still be implemented in Orson. I think it would stay around the 2,000 block level that we currently have, but with 5 minute blocks, it would accelerate the window. So it'd be more like 1 week windows for the difficulty adjustment. And by the way, I'm using Earth time, not Mars time. And I think that this will allow the network to be a little bit more uh, flexible and adaptive so that if there are, for instance, energy shortages on Mars in a given period of time, or the cost of energy goes up and we see a lot of mining go off, that there's an almost instant recognition of that, and the network stays secure. I think as Mars develops and it becomes self sufficient, truly self sufficient, I certainly would envision that they would have a constitution and the establishment of something like a Bill of Rights. I would propose that one of those Bill of Rights be that every person living on Mars has the right to participate in Orson. And in fact, I think every new person born on Mars should be issued one node at birth. And any immigrant to Mars must either bring a node or buy a node, meaning essentially an essential component of participating in the society of Mars is being part of the monetary network and being part of its enforcement. Now, that does imply currencies from another world, by the way, because if an immigrant has to be able to bring one or buy one, there is some understanding from that they may have to exchange currency. And so I do think there will probably be a few Bitcoin nodes running on Mars, and there will be some means for people living on Mars to send, for instance, payments to the U.S. through essentially, or not to the U.S., but to Earth through some sort of intergalactic exchange. But these will be very uncommon. I think these sort of transactions will essentially be batched. Now, there are, of course, many other aspects of the design to consider, but I think these are some of the really big ones. There is a good chance that space exploration and colonization will become big topics in the coming years. As a 60-year-old guy, I think that, and I hope that it happens in my lifetime, because I do agree with Elon. I think that as a survival mechanism, as a propelling the human species forward, we have to leave Earth. We have to have these colonies, and I also think that even for those still on Earth, that the technology that will be developed, and even thinking through these social issues like we're doing here, may help us construct a better society on Earth. Okay, so I guess in summary, though, I would encourage all of you to pay close attention to the darker forces as this comes up, though. And as I said in the beginning, I really object to the manifest destiny terminology used by Trump. I love the spirit of it. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt right now that he wasn't thinking about it, but the Mars is not something for the U.S. to own or any nation state to own. And, it is a chance for us to create society from the ground up and put aside all of these legacy issues, legacy power structures, legacy wealth structures. I think we have a chance to create something really, really special. I don't want to call it utopia. I don't believe that's possible. But we can do something where we build a society where paths to oppression, paths to abuse become much, much harder. And I hope we use Mars as a mechanism to help us do that. So thanks for listening to This Old Man Yells.